What
I
happens
told you
when a
to stay out
broken
of our
war
lives.
veteran
You
and an
think your
abandoned
money means you
husky
can do
stand
whatever
up
you
to a
want?
wealthy man who thinks he owns the world?
You're gonna regret
One
this.
moment of courage, one act of defiance, and an entire town is forced to choose between fear and justice. This isn't just a story. It's a reminder that real strength comes from the heart, and miracles appear when we refuse to stay silent. If you believe in courage, truth, and the power of a loyal companion, subscribe now, because stories like this deserve to be heard. A brittle winter wind swept across the lakeside town, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow and the whisper of something long forgotten. Thomas Reed walked alone along the cracked road that hugged the frozen edge of Lake Windermere, his boots sinking into patches of half-frozen slush. He moved with the slow precision of a man who had learned, painfully and repeatedly, that the world was rarely gentle to those who let their guard down. Every step he took seemed to echo in the hollows of his chest, as though the landscape answered the weight he carried. Thomas was 45, tall but lean to the point of gauntness, with the angular frame of someone who had once been formidable, but had been carved down by time and hardship. His face bore the unmistakable signatures of a man who had lived through war, a sharp jaw dusted with coarse dark stubble, a faint but jagged scar tracing from his left cheekbone to the edge of his jaw, and eyes the color of cold river steel, restless, watchful, always scanning. His hair, once a deep brown, was now streaked with gray, cut short as if he couldn't quite let go of old military discipline. His skin was weather-beaten, pale beneath the winter light, showing signs of sleepless nights and days spent wandering the chill roads of northern England. There was a heaviness to him that was not physical, but something deeper, something born from loss and duty and years of carrying burdens no one ever saw. He had been a soldier, a special operations sergeant who once led men through sandstorms and night raids and the jagged chaos of battlefields. But war had a way of stealing more than it gave. When Thomas returned home, PTSD carved invisible trenches in his mind. His marriage dissolved under the strain, and the job market turned cold to a man who woke screaming at shadows. Now he lived in a small wooden shack near the lake, one he repaired with his own hands, sealing holes and patching roof tiles with scraps he scavenged from abandoned sheds. It wasn't much, but it was a shelter, and the silence around it was something he had grown to accept, even if it never quite felt like peace. That morning, the wind bit fiercely at his face. Snowflakes drifted sideways, stinging his skin like tiny needles. He tightened the threadbare coat he wore, an old army surplus jacket faded to a washed-out olive, and tucked his chin deeper into the frayed collar. He had gone out in search of firewood, knowing the worst of the storm was coming. Winter in the northern lakes was unforgiving, and he had learned the hard way that comfort was a luxury earned by preparation. Still, beneath the practical purpose of his journey lay a gnawing loneliness, one he didn't dare acknowledge, because acknowledging it made it real. And Thomas Reed had spent enough years wrestling with ghosts. As he walked, something thin and broken wove through the howl of the wind, a sound too soft to be the storm, too strained to be the settling ice. Thomas stopped, his breath fogged in front of him, fading quickly into the churning white. He listened again. There it was, a faint whine, the fragile vibration of a creature on the edge of giving up. Thomas's heart lurched before he could stop it. He wished it didn't. Feeling things was costly, but instinct, especially the instinct to protect, was something he had never managed to shut off. He followed the sound around a bend in the road, where snow had collected into uneven drifts. The whine grew louder, shaking with fear, cold, or both. Then he saw it. A small shape curled beside a rusted road marker, barely visible under the sheet of snow accumulating over it. Thomas knelt, brushing away the snow with his gloved hands until the shape became clear. A dog, a young adult Siberian husky, though it looked small now because its body was trembling, its fur soaked and clumped with ice. Its coat, a striking mix of silver and ash white, was marred by dirt and frost, but even beneath the filth, Thomas could see the animal was beautiful. Its eyes, one icy blue, one warm amber, blinked up at him with a desperate wavering hope. Pale lashes fluttered against the snowflakes, clinging to its muzzle. The dog tried to lift its head, but let out a broken cry as though the simple effort cost too much. Thomas reached out slowly, the way one approaches something wounded and afraid. "Easy, mate," he murmured, voice low, roughened by days without conversation. "I'm not here to hurt you." His words formed a cloud in the air, drifting toward the trembling creature. He saw now that the husky was thin, too thin. Its ribs pressed sharply against its skin under the thick fur. A rope collar hung loosely around its neck, frayed and badly knotted, suggesting it had been tied somewhere long enough to fight its restraints. And now it was here, alone, abandoned in the middle of a storm. The sight struck Thomas harder than he expected. He swallowed, feeling something tight twist inside his ribcage. Animals, he remembered, never hid their emotions. They didn't lie. They didn't pretend. They didn't destroy each other with ego or pride. They simply felt and reacted and trusted until the world taught them not to. Maybe that was why seeing this dog near death stirred something that felt dangerously close to grief. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, his voice more breath than sound. The dog blinked slowly, as though the act of keeping its eyes open took courage. Thomas extended his hand, palm up. The husky hesitated, its breath ragged and thin, then pressed its cold nose into his palm. The contact shocked Thomas in ways he hadn't anticipated. The dog's touch was weak but intentional, a plea, a question, a surrender all at once. Something inside him cracked. A soldier knows wounds when he sees them, and this creature was wounded. Physically, yes, but also in its trust. And Thomas understood that too well. "Right," he breathed, steadying. "Himself. Let's get you out of here." He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around the husky's shivering body. The dog whimpered at the sudden movement, but didn't resist. Thomas lifted it cautiously, surprised by how light it was, how fragile something that looked so strong could be. The dog rested its head against his chest, its fur dampening his shirt. The warmth of its breath seeped through the thin fabric, and Thomas felt it like an anchor pulling him somewhere unfamiliar, toward connection, toward responsibility. Two things he had long convinced himself he no longer deserved. The walk back to the cabin was slow. The wind pushed against him, forcing him to lean into each step. But the weight in his arms, small as it was, kept his movements deliberate. Every time the dog whimpered, he murmured reassurance, though he wasn't sure whether it comforted the animal or simply kept his own thoughts from spiraling. By the time he reached the cabin, snow had crusted along his eyelashes, and his fingers ached from the cold. He pushed open the door with his shoulder and stepped inside. The cabin was dim, lit only by the weak gray light leaking through the frosted window. A small pile of firewood lay stacked near the hearth. Thomas lowered the dog gently onto an old wool blanket near the stove and moved quickly to start a fire. Soon flames flickered to life, casting a warm amber glow across the cramped room. The dog's fur gleamed faintly in the light, revealing more of its markings. A dark mask around the eyes, a streak of charcoal along its back, and a snowy underbelly that rose and fell with shallow breaths. Thomas knelt beside it, brushing back damp fur. "You're a fighter," he said softly. "Stubborn too, I imagine. You wouldn't be here otherwise." The dog gazed up at him, its mismatched eyes reflecting the firelight. Something in that look unsettled him. Not fear, not confusion, but recognition. As though the creature saw the fractures inside him and accepted them without judgment. Thomas sat back, resting his elbows on his knees. He wasn't used to being needed, not anymore. Once, he had been responsible for lives, young men who looked to him for orders, for steady hands, for someone to lead them through darkness. He remembered their faces, even now, long after the war had scattered them into memory. He remembered the weight of command, the crushing responsibility of failure, and the quiet horror of surviving when others didn't. The dog shifted slightly, drawing his attention back to the present. Its paws twitched, perhaps dreaming of running through snow rather than dying in it. "You need a name," Thomas murmured. He watched the snow swirling beyond the window, the world outside turning white. He thought of the cold, of survival, of something pure but harsh. "Frost," he said. The dog blinked, as if acknowledging the name with solemn acceptance. "Frost it is." As hours passed, Frost's breathing steadied. Thomas fed him bits of leftover stew and dried meat, watching as the animal regained strength bite by bite. Each small improvement filled Thomas with a quiet relief he didn't fully understand. He wasn't used to feeling responsible for something that could break, not since his marriage ended, not since the battlefield took parts of him he never reclaimed. But Frost was here now, alive because Thomas chose to care. When night fell, the cabin glowed with warmth. Frost curled near the stove, no longer trembling, his mismatched eyes tracking Thomas's every movement. The storm outside howled with a ferocity that could swallow the unprepared, but inside, two wounded souls, one man, one dog, found the faint, fragile outline of companionship. Thomas leaned back in his creaking chair and exhaled slowly. The day had changed him, or perhaps it had changed something dormant inside him, coaxing it awake. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Hardship was still there. Poverty still pressed at the edges of his life. Pain still haunted him like a loyal shadow. But, for the first time in years, Thomas Reed was not truly alone, and neither was Frost. Two weary hearts, abandoned for different reasons, had crossed paths in a storm, and though the world outside remained cold and unyielding, something warm had begun to grow quietly between them, the kind of warmth that could change everything, if they let it. The morning after the storm settled into a brittle, pale quiet, and the icy crust on the ground crunched beneath Thomas Reed's boots as he walked toward town, with Frost trotting beside him. The dog, now warmer and stronger after a night of rest, kept close to Thomas's leg, his mismatched eyes flicking around with alert focus. Frost's fur had regained some of its natural fluff, though hints of his ordeal still clung to the thinness of his frame and the slight hesitation in his gait. Yet, there was something unmistakable about him now, a quiet resilience, a flicker of spirit rekindling beneath the surface. Thomas, meanwhile, felt the unfamiliar weight of purpose. He had woken early, unable to lie idle while the meager woodpile dwindled, so he headed to the only place in town that occasionally offered him work, Harrington's Diner, a weathered building with faded red paint and a sagging roofline that clung stubbornly to life. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him a few pounds here and there, enough to buy bread, maybe canned soup, or dog food now that Frost was part of his world. The thought of providing for the dog stirred a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. When he reached the diner, the bell above the door chimed its rusty little note. Warmth rushed out to meet him, along with the mingled smell of frying onions and old wood polish. Frost stayed just inside the entryway, shaking snow from his coat before sitting neatly beside a boot mat. Thomas glanced down at him, amused at how quickly the dog had adopted a soldier's discipline. "Stay close," Thomas murmured. Frost chuffed softly as if to say he already knew. Behind the counter stood Margaret Lane, the owner. She was a stout woman in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked auburn hair pinned in a messy bun that never quite managed to tame itself. Her round face, dusted with freckles, always seemed stuck somewhere between a scowl and a smile, though her eyes, warm brown with faint crow's feet, held a softness she pretended not to have. Margaret had seen her share of hardship, a divorce 2 decades earlier, a son lost to illness, and a diner she had fought tooth and nail to keep afloat. Hardship had made her stern, but not unkind. "You're late," she said without looking up from the coffee pot she was scrubbing, her voice roughened from years of cigarette smoke she claimed she'd quit but hadn't. "I'm early," Thomas replied, removing his gloves. "You just started without me." Margaret snorted. "If you were any more of a smart aleck, I'd start charging you for breathing my air." She turned then, catching sight of Frost sitting obediently by the wall. Her expression softened automatically, though she tried to hide it behind stern eyebrows. "That the dog you found?" Thomas nodded. "Husky, tough little thing, near dead in the snow." "Well, he's pretty," she said, leaning over the counter for a better look. "Too pretty to be out there alone. You keeping him?" Thomas hesitated, as though admitting it might shatter the fragile certainty forming in his chest. "Looks like it," he said quietly. Margaret's lips twitched into a smile she concealed by turning back to the sink. "Good. You need something to keep that stubborn heart of yours warm." Before Thomas could answer, a young woman burst through the kitchen door. She was Lily Marsh, one of the diner's 2 servers. Lily was in her early 20s, tall and slender with long strawberry blonde hair that she kept tied back with a frayed ribbon. Her skin was pale, dusted lightly with pink, as though the winter air had permanently kissed her cheeks. Her eyes, large, green, and filled with earnest determination, made her seem softer than she actually was. Months of working double shifts had carved faint shadows under those eyes, but she never complained. She needed the money to support her younger brother. "Morning, Thomas," Lily said brightly, though her voice carried a faint tremor. "Hi, Frost." She knelt briefly to scratch behind the dog's ears, earning a grateful wag of the tail. "Morning," Thomas replied. He studied her for a moment. Lily had a way of smiling even when her shoulders sagged with fatigue. It reminded him of young medics he'd served with, kids who were exhausted and terrified, but still went back into fire because someone needed help. The diner grew busy faster than expected. Lunch rush had come early, and soon Thomas found himself carrying trays, bussing tables, and shoveling ice melt onto the steps outside. Frost lay near the coat rack, occasionally raising his head to track Thomas's movements with loyal vigilance. Customers cooed over the dog, offering scraps that Thomas politely declined on Frost's behalf. The atmosphere was warm, almost cheerful, until the door swung open with a cold gust trailing behind it. A tall man in a charcoal wool coat stepped inside, removing his gloves with a sharp, impatient flick. Everything about him radiated money and entitlement. His blonde hair was styled back with glossy precision, his jaw clean-shaven and sharp, his features too handsome in a polished, smug way. His posture was rigid, as though he expected the world to part for him. This was Harold Whitmore, a wealthy businessman from the neighboring city, known for purchasing struggling properties and flipping them for profit. In his mid-30s, Harold carried himself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. His light blue eyes were attractive at first glance, but looking closer revealed a chilling emptiness beneath. Rumors followed him about his temper, his ruthless dealings, his tendency to treat working-class people as expendable, but his money shielded him from consequences. He removed his coat and scarf with dramatic care, as though handling priceless silk instead of wool. Harold scanned the diner, visibly unimpressed, then strode toward a booth near the window. He sat without acknowledging anyone and tapped a manicured finger against the table impatiently. Lily approached with her polite smile in place, though Thomas noticed the way her hands tightened around her notepad. "Good afternoon, sir. What can I get you today?" Harold didn't look at her immediately. He continued tapping his finger. Tap, tap, tap. Finally he spoke, his voice smooth but laced with ice. "Coffee, black, and don't make it weak like last time." Lily nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll bring it right out." Harold waved a dismissive hand, already done with her presence. Thomas watched the interaction from behind the counter. Something in Harold's demeanor prickled old instincts, danger, arrogance, the precursors to escalation. Minutes later, Lily returned to Harold's table with the steaming cup of coffee. As she set it down, her hand trembled slightly from fatigue. A few drops splashed onto the table, not on Harold, not even near him, but enough to draw his attention. His expression hardened instantly. "Are you completely incompetent?" he hissed, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Do you make a habit of ruining things, or is it just for me?" Lily froze. Her eyes widened in embarrassment. I'm sorry, sir. Let me clean that." She reached for a napkin, but Harold slapped her hand away. Not hard enough to injure, but firm enough to humiliate. "Don't touch anything. You'll only make it worse." The diner fell silent. Even Frost lifted his head, sensing the shift in the air. Thomas took a slow breath, clenching his jaw. His body remained still, but his mind sharpened with the familiar tension of a man assessing danger. He had seen men like Harold before, men whose wealth acted like armor, whose tempers hurt those who couldn't fight back. Margaret stepped forward slightly, her expression darkening, but she hesitated. Harold was powerful. He could ruin her business with a phone call. Harold leaned back in his seat and glared at Lily with venomous disdain. "I swear, this town hires the most useless people. Look at you. Can't even carry a cup properly. How pathetic." Lily swallowed hard, blinking rapidly to keep tears from falling. Then Harold did something that made Thomas move before he even realized he'd made a decision. Harold lifted his hand, open-palmed, preparing to strike. Frost growled first, a deep warning sound like rolling thunder. Thomas crossed the diner in 3 long strides, placing himself between Lily and Harold just as the businessman's arm began to swing. "Enough," Thomas said, voice low but resonant with authority that didn't need to shout to be heard. Harold's hand hovered in the air, shocked into stillness. Thomas stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes steady, not aggressive, but unyielding. Frost was at his side, posture rigid, mismatched eyes locked, on to Harold with fierce intelligence. Harold withdrew his hand slowly, as though lowering a weapon. His lips curled into an incredulous sneer. "Who exactly do you think you are?" "Someone telling you to sit down," Thomas replied calmly. Whispers moved through the diner like a breeze as eyes locked onto the confrontation. Harold scoffed. "This is none of your concern. You raised your hand to a girl half your size. That makes it my concern." A flush crept up Harold's neck. Anger, embarrassment, or both. "I'll have you know, I don't care who you are," Thomas cut in. "Sit down." Harold froze. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Thomas's presence carried weight, not the weight of wealth or reputation, but something Harold couldn't measure: experience, quiet strength, the unwavering courage of someone who had seen real violence and wasn't afraid of the petty cruelty. Harold stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. He pointed a shaking finger at Thomas. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "I don't forget insults." Thomas didn't blink. "Neither do I." Harold grabbed his coat and stormed toward the door, muttering curses under his breath. Frost followed his movement with a predator's focus until the door slammed behind the businessman. The diner remained silent after Harold's departure. Lily stood trembling, unsure whether to cry or apologize. Thomas turned to her, his expression softening. "You all right?" he asked. Lily nodded weakly. Yes, thank you." Margaret approached, her tough facade cracking into gratitude. "Thomas, I swear, if you weren't around, anyone would have done the same," he murmured. "No," Margaret said firmly. "Not anyone." Frost pressed against Thomas's leg, leaning into him. Thomas rested a hand on the dog's head, but beneath the calm, he felt something unsettling, a storm he had not yet weathered. Harold Whitmore was not a man who accepted humiliation, and Thomas Reed had just made himself a target. The night crept in early over the town, shrouding the streets in a dim blue haze as the lamps flickered to life one by one. Frost walked at Thomas's side, alert but unusually quiet, sensing the tension that clung to his handler like an invisible shroud. Thomas's jaw was tight, his breath visible in the cold air, as he replayed the confrontation with Harold Whitmore again and again. Something inside him warned that the wealthy businessman would not simply swallow the humiliation and walk away. Men like Harold weren't shaped by adversity. They were shaped by privilege, and privilege did not forgive. Inside Harrington's diner, the last customers had left, and only the warm crackle of the old radiator filled the silence. Margaret Lane wiped down the counter with slow, thoughtful strokes. Lily Marsh stacked the remaining plates with trembling hands, still shaken from the earlier incident. Frost curled near Thomas's feet, mismatched eyes scanning the shadows. Margaret cast a cautious look at Thomas. "I know that look," she murmured. "You're waiting for something." "Not waiting," Thomas replied, though his voice betrayed a sense of foreboding. "Preparing." Lily glanced at him, concern knitting her brows. "Do you really think Harold would do something? I mean, he left angry, but he didn't leave defeated," Thomas finished quietly. "That's worse." The room fell silent. None of them had to say it aloud. Harold Whitmore had power, connections, and the ego of a man who could buy consequences instead of facing them. Frost stirred restlessly, ears twitching. Then the diner door opened. 3 men stepped inside, tracking in the cold night air. They were dressed in dark coats, expensive fabrics tailored to broad shoulders. Their faces were unfamiliar to Thomas. He never forgot a face, but their mannerisms were unmistakable. These were men used to delivering messages, not starting conversations. The leader of the group stood slightly ahead of the others. He was tall, in his 40s, with a square jaw covered in neatly trimmed salt and pepper stubble. His eyes were a pale gray, cold enough to reflect nothing back. His hair was slicked back with meticulous care, and the way he walked suggested he'd once been athletic, before time, money, or corruption softened him. His name was Victor Hale, though Thomas did not know this yet. Victor was Harold Whitmore's personal fixer, a man who handled problems discreetly. Rumor whispered he had once been a police officer, dismissed for excessive force, an accusation he wore as a badge of honor rather than shame. "Evening," Victor said, voice smooth but carrying a weight that made the room's warmth evaporate. "We're looking for Thomas Reed." Thomas stepped forward, Frost rising to stand beside him. "That'd be me." Victor's lips curled into something resembling a smile but lacking any warmth. "Mr. Whitmore sends his regards. He wanted to offer you an opportunity to correct your earlier mistake." "What mistake?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the angle they were approaching. Victor's eyes glinted. "The mistake of assuming you could put your hands where they didn't belong, or interfering in business that wasn't yours." "I didn't lay a hand on him." Victor shrugged. "Not what he told us." Lily stepped forward impulsively, fear and indignation coloring her voice. "That's not true. Thomas protected me. Harold was going to hit me." Victor's head snapped toward her in a way that made Lily flinch. "Careful, miss. Lies can get people in trouble." Thomas stepped subtly between Victor and Lily, his voice cooling several degrees. "Whatever Harold told you, the truth is—" Victor raised a hand, silencing him. "The truth," he said lightly, "is whatever the people in charge decide it is. And Harold Whitmore is very much in charge." Frost's fur bristled along his spine. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, not loud, but enough to draw Victor's attention. "A dog," Victor murmured. "Fitting." Margaret, who had remained silent until now, suddenly slammed her hand on the counter. "You have no right to come into my establishment making threats. Get out." Victor looked at her with mild amusement. "I'm not threatening anyone. The police will handle the rest." "Police?" Thomas repeated, though he had already guessed the next move. Victor nodded. "Yes. Mr. Whitmore has filed a report that you assaulted him and commanded your dog to attack. Lucky for you, he's charitable enough to settle the matter quietly if you apologize publicly and pay damages." Thomas stared at him, disbelief flashing across his features. "He's lying." Victor's smile widened, enjoying the helpless anger in Thomas's eyes. "Of course he is. But he told the police first. And in cases like this, the first story is the one that sticks." The diner door burst open again. This time, it wasn't Harold's men. It was the police. Two officers stepped inside, their breaths heavy from the cold. The first was Officer Brent Miller, a man in his late 30s with a bulky frame that strained his uniform buttons. His face was perpetually flushed, his jaw unshaven, and a thin scar traced his chin, a mark received not in heroism, but in a drunken bar fight he had never quite lived down. Miller carried himself with the swagger of someone who enjoyed authority more than he deserved. The second officer, Tom Avery, was younger, slimmer, with sandy blonde hair and nervous eyes. His demeanor suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation, but didn't have the courage to question it. Officer Miller spoke first. "Thomas Reed, you're under arrest for assault and intentional use of a dangerous animal." Lily gasped. Margaret swore under her breath. Frost growled. Thomas exhaled slowly. "You can't be serious." Officer Avery looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Officer Miller, however, grinned. "Dead serious. Now put your hands where I can see them." Victor Hale stepped back, folding his arms with satisfaction. Harold's plan was unfolding perfectly. Thomas raised his hands slowly, his heart hammered, not out of fear for himself, but fear for Frost. "Don't make this difficult," Miller barked, pulling out his cuffs. Frost moved instantly, positioning himself between Thomas and the approaching officers. His body lowered, mismatched eyes fierce with intelligence. A warning growl rippled through the air. "Get that mutt back," Miller snapped. "He's just scared," Thomas said, his voice calm despite the storm building inside him. "Let me tell him to—" But Miller didn't wait. He grabbed a metal catchpole from Avery's hands, a long rod with a tightening loop at the end. The device was meant for restraining dangerous animals, not trained companions. Miller extended it toward Frost, swinging the loop around the dog's neck in one aggressive motion. Frost yelped, a sharp, agonizing cry that sliced straight through Thomas's chest. Time seemed to fracture. Thomas lunged forward. "Stop! You're hurting him!" But Miller yanked the pole back viciously, dragging Frost across the diner floor. The dog scrambled, paws scraping helplessly against the tiles as he desperately tried to reach Thomas. His mismatched eyes widened in confusion and terror. Thomas moved to intervene, only to feel cold steel slam around his wrists. The handcuffs clicked shut with brutal finality. Officer Avery held him back, though his hands shook. "Just stay still, sir. Please, Thomas's pulse roared in his ears. "Let him go. He's trained. He's not a threat." Miller sneered. "Everything's a threat when someone like you commands it." He dragged Frost toward the door, the husky choking against the tightening loop. Frost cried again, weaker now, and Thomas felt something inside him tear open. He struggled instinctively, muscles coiling to fight, but the memories of battlefield chaos surged forward, blinding him with images he had spent years trying to bury. Men he couldn't save, dogs he had lost, orders he couldn't disobey. His breath caught in his throat, a tremor running through his body. Avery tightened his grip, misunderstanding the tremor as resistance. "Don't make it worse," he pleaded, but nothing could possibly be worse than hearing Frost's strangled whimpers fade into the night as Miller shoved the dog into the back of a police van. Thomas's vision blurred. He saw Frost's eyes, hurt, confused, betrayed, and something inside him shattered. They dragged Thomas outside into the cold. Snowflakes clung to his hair and lashes, melting against the heat of his fury. Margaret stood in the doorway, her hands trembling with rage and helplessness. Lily covered her mouth, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "Thomas," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." But Thomas could not answer. Avery pushed him into the back of the patrol car, and the door slammed shut, sealing him in isolation. The engine rumbled to life. As the car pulled away from the diner, Thomas pressed his forehead against the cold metal grate behind the driver's seat. He closed his eyes, and the darkness welcomed him back with familiar arms, the darkness of war, of loss, of things taken from him without mercy. Hours later, the jail cell door clanged shut. The space smelled of mildew and disinfectant, dimly lit by a flickering bulb that buzzed like a swarm of dying insects. The concrete bench was cold, but Thomas did not feel it. He felt only the absence of Frost. Memories surged, of battlefield explosions, of comrades dragged from his arms, of canine partners lying still in the dirt. His breathing grew ragged as the ghosts clawed at him. He sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly as though praying to something he no longer believed in. He had lost so much in life. But Frost had been the first thing he'd gained in years, and now he had been taken too. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, echoing the hollow, aching grief inside the man who had nothing left but pain. The night after Thomas's arrest stretched long and silent over Windermere, its darkness thick as ink. Frost's desperate cries still rang in the ears of everyone who had witnessed the scene, echoes of pain that refused to fade. Harrington's diner felt emptier than ever. The chairs were stacked, the lights dimmed, but the air remained heavy with guilt, fear, and a smoldering ember of quiet outrage. Lily Marsh stood behind the counter, trembling as she replayed the events long after the officers dragged Thomas away. The girl's pale face was streaked with dried tears, her strawberry blonde hair disheveled from pulling at it throughout the night. Her delicate, slender frame seemed even smaller under the weight of what she had seen. A good man brutalized because a wealthy coward demanded vengeance. Margaret Lane watched her with a worried frown. The older woman's broad shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but her spirit was still burning, flickering under her stern exterior. She set a steaming mug of chamomile tea in front of Lily. "Drink," she ordered softly. "You'll catch your death if you keep shaking like that." Lily wrapped her cold fingers around the mug but didn't drink. "We can't just let this happen," she whispered. "We won't," Margaret said, though her voice wavered subtly. "But fighting Harold Whitmore isn't simple. He doesn't lose." "He hasn't met enough people brave enough to challenge him," another voice said quietly from the doorway. Both women turned. Emily Carter stepped inside, the young woman from the convenience shop at the corner, known for her bright spirit and habit of helping anyone who needed help. Emily was 22, with warm chestnut hair that fell in soft waves to her shoulders, and expressive hazel eyes that often glowed with empathy. She worked 2 jobs to care for her sick father, leaving little time for rest, but kindness had carved itself into her bones. Even now, her cheeks were flushed from running through the cold, and her breath came out in clouds. "I saw everything," Emily said, lifting her phone. "And I recorded it," Lily gasped. You filmed Harold?" Emily nodded. "Every second. I was outside when he left the diner screaming about humiliation. I knew he'd try something, so I stayed close. When the police arrived, I followed them in. I recorded everything the moment Miller grabbed Frost. Her voice cracked slightly at the memory. Margaret gripped Emily's shoulders. You brave girl. Emily swallowed, shaking her head. I was terrified. But Thomas didn't deserve what happened to him. And that dog, Frost's cry. Her voice broke completely and she took a shaky breath. We have to get them both back. Lily wiped her eyes. Do you think they'll believe us? Maybe not us, Emily answered, determination sharpening her features. But they'll believe the evidence. Margaret's eyes widened. There's only one man in this town who might listen. Chief Arthur Blake, Lily whispered. Arthur Blake, the police chief of Windermere, was a man in his early 60s with steel-gray hair, a tall, lean frame, and a sharply defined face that rarely betrayed emotion. His weathered skin and deep-set eyes gave him the appearance of someone who had seen too much of humanity's failures, yet refused to surrender to them. Known for fairness, feared for his discipline, Blake was not a man swayed by money or influence, but even he had blind spots, and Thomas Reed had fallen into one. Margaret grabbed her coat. Let's go, before Harold Whitmore poisons Blake's ear. The sky outside was still pitch black, though dawn was only a few hours away. The three women hurried through the quiet streets, boots crunching over thin layers of frost. Snowflakes drifted lazily, reflecting the glow of street lamps like tiny fireflies. Lily clutched her coat tightly. Do you think Chief Blake will even see us at this hour? Chief Blake hasn't slept past 5 a day in his life, Margaret muttered. He'll be awake. Windermere Police Station stood like a grim monument beside the frozen river, its stone walls frosted white at the edges. The lights inside were dim, except for Chief Blake's office, where a warm yellow glow indicated he was working late. Again. They pushed through the front doors, startling the night desk officer, who nearly spilled his tea. We need to see Chief Blake, Margaret said, leaving no room for argument. The officer hesitated. He's in the middle of paperwork. Margaret placed both hands on the desk. If you don't get him out here right now, I swear I'll march into his office myself. The young officer blinked, intimidated by the fire in her voice. Yes, ma'am. Moments later, Chief Arthur Blake emerged from his office. He stood tall, his posture rigid, his neatly pressed uniform immaculate even at this hour. His stern gaze swept over the three women, then softened slightly in recognition. What's wrong? Blake asked. Emily stepped forward. Sir, it's about Thomas Reed. At the name, Blake's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The man arrested for assault? No, Emily said. The man falsely accused of assault, Lily added quickly. Harold Whitmore lied. Thomas didn't touch him, and Frost didn't attack anyone. Margaret crossed her arms. Your officers arrested the wrong man, Arthur. Chief Blake inhaled deeply, his expression unreadable. Accusations like that require evidence. Emily handed him her phone. That's why we're here. Blake accepted it, his fingers steady, but his eyes narrowing in focus. He pressed play. The video captured everything. Harold insulting Lily, raising his hand to strike her. Thomas stepping in, Frost growling. Protectively, but not attacking. Harold's furious retreat, and finally the arrival of the officers. Miller's aggression, Avery's hesitation, and the brutal way they seized Frost. The recording ended with Thomas's voice breaking as Frost was dragged away, and the station went utterly silent. Blake stood motionless, the faint hum of fluorescent lights echoing through the hall. He replayed the last few seconds. Frost's cry, Thomas's anguish, Miller's sneering authority. When he finally looked up, something had changed in his face. The stern lines had deepened, but the coldness had melted into fiery purpose. I was lied to, he said quietly. Sir, Lily whispered, you can fix this. Blake exhaled slowly. Yes, I can, and I will. He reached for his radio. Thomas Reed sat silently in his cell, the flickering bulb casting shadows that danced like specters across the concrete floor. His eyes were half closed, his breathing uneven as memories clawed their way out of the past. Explosions in the desert, screams, the weight of a fallen comrade in his arms, and Frost dragged away, helpless. A sound echoed down the hallway. Footsteps, firm, purposeful. Then, Reed. Thomas lifted his head slowly. Chief Arthur Blake stood on the other side of the bars, keys in hand. Behind him were Lily, Margaret, Emily, and Officer Avery, his face pale with guilt. Blake unlocked the door. "You're free to go." Thomas blinked, dazed. "What?" "We have evidence clearing you of all charges," Blake said. His tone carried both apology and respect. "You were defending a young woman from assault, and your dog was acting to protect you." Thomas rose slowly, feeling the weight of the night fall away. "Frost," he whispered. "Where is he?" Blake's expression softened. "Follow me." They led him through a hallway lined with holding cages. Thomas's pulse quickened. He scanned each enclosure until a whimper, then a soft, choked bark. "Frost?" A figure shifted in the dim light, a silver and white husky, eyes mismatched and shining with desperate hope. Thomas didn't wait. He rushed forward as Blake unlocked the cage. Frost bolted out, launching himself into Thomas's arms with trembling eagerness. The man fell to his knees, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. Frost whined, licking his face, tail wagging so hard it thumped against the floor like a drum. Thomas held him tightly, feeling the warmth, the life, the trust. The station fell silent, not out of fear, but reverence. Because in that moment, every soul in the room understood what they were witnessing. Two beings battered by the world, reunited in a way that felt like a small miracle. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas allowed himself to breathe, allowed himself to hope. The first hint of morning light touched the frozen surface of Lake Windermere with a pale gold shimmer, like someone had brushed the world with a soft stroke of warmth after weeks of unbroken cold. The town stirred slowly, its rooftops dusted with a thin sheet of frost that made the chimneys and stone walls glow faintly in the quiet dawn. The night's bitter wind had finally calmed, leaving behind a peaceful hush that felt almost ceremonial, like the world was pausing to acknowledge that something had changed. For Thomas Reed, standing on the small porch of his weathered wooden cabin, that change felt both unreal and deeply grounding. Frost sat at his feet, tail curled around his paws like a fluffy silver scarf, his mismatched eyes fixed on the horizon. The dog's breath puffed softly into the cold air, creating cloudlets that rose and vanished in the soft early light. His fur had regained much of its natural volume, gleaming with life again now that warmth, safety, and companionship had returned. Thomas rested a hand on Frost's head, his thumb brushing the soft fur between the dog's ears. A faint smile curved the corners of his lips, a rare, quiet smile that seemed to thaw something deep in his chest. "Looks like we made it," he murmured. Behind them, the cabin door creaked as Margaret Lane stepped outside, bundled in a thick-knitted scarf and a burgundy coat. Her usually stern features looked softer in the morning glow, and the crow's feet around her eyes deepened as she smiled. "Thomas, you'll freeze to death standing out here without breakfast. Come inside, there's tea and toast." Thomas nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Margaret." "You can thank me by eating it," she grumbled, though the warmth in her tone betrayed her affection. She turned to go inside, adding, "And wipe your boots this time. I just swept." Thomas chuckled quietly. Margaret had been the first to show up at Thomas's cabin after the police released him and Frost. She'd arrived with blankets, groceries, and a shovel, declaring the place unfit for human habitation and immediately taking charge. It was only later that Thomas learned the whole town had rallied behind him. Word of Harold Whitmore's downfall had spread fast. Harold's downfall came swiftly, more swiftly than even those who despised him could have imagined. The recording Emily provided, combined with sworn statements from other customers in Harrington's diner, was irrefutable. Harold's lies had been blatant, his manipulation blatant, and his cruelty unmistakable on camera. The police department, facing public outrage and Chief Arthur Blake's stern condemnation, filed charges of false reporting and public endangerment. The Whitmore family's pristine reputation shattered overnight. Harold's father, Reginald Whitmore, emerged in town the next day, a man in his late 60s with snow-white hair, combed back with meticulous pride, a rigid spine, and an expression carved from years of entitlement. His tailored navy suit contrasted sharply with the anger that burned beneath his cool exterior. But even Reginald, accustomed to controlling narratives with wealth, could not silence the footage circulating through Windermere's social channels. His son's disgrace became a spectacle he could not buy his way out of, and the Whitmore name became an object of shame rather than power. Reginald's brief appearance only amplified the town's support for Thomas. For years, many had feared the Whitmore influence, but now fear had broken. In its place rose indignation, unity, and gratitude for the man who had protected one of their own. It was Lily Marsh who first suggested helping Thomas repair his cabin. The young woman arrived at Harrington's diner early the morning after Thomas's release, eyes bright despite exhaustion, and declared, "He saved me. The least this town can do is give something back." The idea spread like fire. Now, as the sun crawled higher above the hills, small groups of townsfolk began converging along the gravel road that led to Thomas's home. They brought tools, lumber, paint, insulation, spare blankets, and steaming flasks of cocoa. There were carpenters, retirees with too much time and too many opinions, teenagers looking for something good to do, and neighbors who had barely spoken to Thomas before, but now offered their assistance with genuine warmth. One of them was Oliver Pratt, a retired tradesman in his late 50s with thinning gray hair, a thick mustache, and hands roughened by decades of carpentry. He was stocky, with a kindly round face and a belly that hinted at a long-standing love affair with meat pies. Oliver had a reputation for being blunt, loyal, and stubborn in equal measure. "Your roof's a disgrace," he announced gruffly when he arrived. "We're tearing the whole thing down." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Morning to you too, Oliver." Oliver snorted. "Don't get cheeky. Get your hammer." Another group consisted of Martha and Howard Finch, an elderly couple known for knitting scarves for locals every winter. Martha was small, with silver curls and warm brown eyes that seemed to smile even before her lips did. Howard was lanky as a scarecrow, with deep wrinkles and a gentle stoop to his shoulders. They carried a box of wool blankets and a bag of dog treats almost larger than Martha herself. "For Frost," she said with a wink. "He deserves something nice after all he's been through." Frost wagged his tail so hard his whole back half shimmied. Thomas stood watching the scene unfold, overwhelmed. He had grown accustomed to solitude, had believed it was his natural state, but seeing his cabin surrounded by people laughing, hammering, working together, he felt something unfamiliar swelling in his chest. Belonging. Emily Carter arrived shortly after, wearing a thick beige coat, lined with faux fur. Her chestnut hair glowed in the morning light, and her hazel eyes sparkled with quiet pride as she approached Thomas. "You look better," she said. "So do you," Thomas replied softly. Emily smiled, her cheeks warming. "I didn't sleep much last night," she admitted, "but I kept thinking about how Frost ran to you the moment he saw you. It reminded me, not everything in life turns to loss." Thomas's throat tightened slightly. He looked away, focusing on Frost, who was happily accepting treats from Martha Finch. "Losing things is easier when you expect it," he said. "It's the getting them back that scares you." Emily considered his words. "Maybe getting them back is the point. Maybe you're not meant to carry everything alone." He didn't answer, but the quiet gratitude in his eyes was unmistakable. Later that afternoon, when the repairs slowed and people paused for food, Margaret Lane gathered everyone around the long wooden table she'd set up outside. Beside her stood Chief Arthur Blake. Although he remained a stoic figure, with posture firm and expression serious, there was a new softness behind his gaze when he looked at Thomas and Frost. Margaret cleared her throat. "Thomas," she began, "this town owes you more than repairs. You stood up for Lily when nobody else dared to. You proved you're a man with integrity, bravery, and a heart big enough to protect people who needed it." Thomas shifted uneasily under the collective attention. Margaret continued, "You've worked in my diner longer than most folks realize. You always do what's asked without complaint, and you've shown you're more responsible and capable than half the people running establishments in this town." She paused, her eyes warming. "So, Harrington's Diner would like to offer you a position as our new manager." A wave of murmured approval swept through the crowd. Thomas blinked. "Me?" "Yes, you," Margaret said with a chuckle. "Don't act so surprised. You're the only one who keeps the place from burning down when I'm not around." Lily chimed in, grinning widely. "You really are, Thomas. Please say yes." For a moment, Thomas felt suspended in time. The world had taken so much from him: family, purpose, identity. Yet here, in this modest town by the lake, people were offering him something he never expected to have again: a future. He nodded slowly. "All right, I'll do it." The crowd erupted into applause, and Frost barked proudly as if he understood the importance of the moment. Weeks passed. The cabin transformed from a lone, deteriorating structure into a warm, welcoming home. Walls were insulated, leaks sealed, the roof replaced. Martha knitted a thick blanket specifically for Thomas and another for Frost. Howard built a sturdy wooden dog bed. Oliver, grumbling affectionately, installed a new stove, because a man needs a decent fire in winter. At the diner, Thomas settled naturally into his new role. He organized schedules, fixed old equipment, soothed irate customers, and ensured Lily had lighter shifts so she could rest. His calm strength set the tone of the entire establishment. Emily often visited during her breaks, bringing Frost treats or sitting with Thomas at the counter while he drank his evening tea. Their conversations grew longer, warmer. She helped him navigate small things he had forgotten, how to laugh at simple jokes, how to share stories without fear, how to let someone stand close without flinching. Every morning, before heading to work, Thomas and Frost stood by the lake to watch the sunrise. Frost leaned against him, and Thomas rested a hand on the dog's back as the golden light washed over them. One dawn in particular felt different, calmer, richer. Emily walked up behind them, hugging her coat to her body. "Mind if I join you?" Thomas smiled softly. "Never." They stood quietly, the three of them, man, friend, and loyal dog, gazing at the brightening horizon. Frost lifted his head as the sunlight glimmered across the water, his eyes reflecting the dawn. Thomas breathed deeply, the cold air filling his lungs with something that felt like renewal. Maybe, he thought, broken lives could truly be rebuilt. Maybe the sun always rose for those who kept walking through darkness. And as the light warmed his face, Thomas Reed finally believed he could belong to this world again. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they come quietly, through an unexpected act of kindness, through a stranger who chooses courage, or through a loyal animal who refuses to give up on the person he loves. This story reminds us that God still works in the small, hidden corners of our lives. He lifts the broken, guides the lost, and places people on our path exactly when we need them. And even in our everyday struggles, the tired mornings, the lonely nights, the burdens we carry in silence, His grace is still moving, still protecting, still shaping us into something stronger. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to support our work. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any new stories of faith, courage, and kindness. May God bless you, strengthen your spirit, and protect your loved ones. And if you believe His miracles are still alive in our world, type Amen in the comments below.